University of Hawaii Press. I have 8 copies available for sale. If anyone's interested, there's a copy out there, and have those available afterwards. So, just a little bit of context. The Hawaiian archipelago is the most isolated archipelago in the world, located pretty much in the middle of the central tropical Pacific. This line around the archipelago shows the 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about, especially with some of the baleen whales, basically takes into account distribution throughout that entire range, because that's the area that a lot of the large vessel surveys have covered. Now, if you look at it in terms of oceanography, this is a chlorophyll map that shows chlorophyll A, which is basically an indicator of primary productivity. It's produced by phytoplankton. The bright red areas and yellow areas are really productive areas. If you think along the west coast of the U.S., the water there is so murky because there's so much life in it. Phytoplankton, zooplankton, and is basically rich throughout the water column. Now, the blue areas are areas where there's very little phytoplankton. And if you zoom in on the area around Hawaii, it's right in the middle of that big blue patch. Now, zoomed in around the islands, the northwestern Hawaiian Islands and the main Hawaiian Islands, you can see that some of them do have an increase in productivity right around the island. And that productivity in the middle of a big, basically oceanic desert creates an oasis. And a lot of what we've been studying is species that have found this oasis and taken advantage of this oasis. Now, the oasis itself is formed through a variety of factors. Rainfall, primarily on the windward sides of the islands, basically washes a lot of nutrients into the water. Nutrients are used by phytoplankton to grow. If you look at the currents and the winds, the currents come from the east and go to the west. And when they hit the islands, they basically bring cold, nutrient-rich water up towards the surface. This actually shows a wind map. And when the winds hit the islands, especially this island, they basically are deflected by the island itself and funnel around the island. These bright orange areas are much windier than obviously the blue areas. And what the winds do is create a series of eddies that spin off the west side of the island. Some of these eddies are upwelling eddies. Again, they bring cold, nutrient-rich water up to the surface that then increases productivity. Some of them are downwelling eddies that basically concentrate phytoplankton along the edges. So it may not make it more productive, but it makes it more predictable where different species of fish or predators of fish can find prey. And of the different species of whales and dolphins in Hawaiian waters, there's 18 species of toothed whales and dolphins, and 11 of those 18 species have basically made this oasis around the main Hawaiian Islands their year-round home, and they've been basically using this oasis probably for tens of thousands of years. Now, I first started working in Hawaii in 1999. I was working over on Maui and was hired by an organization to do research on whales and dolphins. At that stage, almost everyone in Hawaii, with the exception of Dan McSweeney here on this island, that was studying whales, was studying humpback whales. And those folks who were studying dolphins in Hawaii were all studying spinner dolphins. So I didn't really want to overlap with those people or compete with those people. So instead of studying humpback whales or spinner dolphins, I decided to work with some of the other species. Now, we've used a lot of different boats for our work. We go out in the morning, come back in the afternoon. This is the boat we're currently using. It's a 24-foot rigid hull Zodiac. Has a nice little custom bow pulpit on and a little canopy to give at least the driver a little bit of shade. And we're basically working with a lot of different species, and we're asking a lot of different questions. So basic ones are the species that we encounter resident to the islands or part of open ocean populations. How are they using their environment? And that includes using it in 3 dimensions. So how deep they're diving, whether or not they're diving differently during the day and night, and how much they move among the islands as well as around the island. So are they using the windward sides as well as the leeward side? How many there are, what the abundance of the different populations are. And lastly, we're trying to look at what the impacts of human activities are. Now, a little video I'll show. Before I start it, I'll just point out these 2 little devices here on either side of the camera lens. So this is recorded from a GoPro on the photographer's head. These devices are green lasers. So basically, they're mounted in this bracket 15 centimeters apart. So they project these two green dots 15 centimeters apart onto the dorsal fin or body of a whale. And because they are that precise distance, we can use it to measure the animal. So we're getting photos and we're getting measurements, so we can say, is this an adult male or probably a female? Is it a particularly large individual or a smaller individual? Now this is off of Hawaii, working with a false killer whale. And this fellow here in the bow is Daniel Webster, who is over here in the back. He's holding an air rifle. One of the tools that we use to study these animals are satellite tags, which is launched from this air rifle. So the false killer whale swims around, is going to come up over on the other side of the boat. You'll notice a few different people with cameras, one of whom is him over here as well. We have usually 3 different photographers trying to get photos. And right there, Daniel tagged that whale. So good work. One of the advantages of tagging them is sort of illustrated in the next slide, which is we're really almost only able to work over on the leeward sides of the islands, the west sides of the islands. Whereas once we put a tag on a whale, it doesn't matter where we tagged it, it could move anywhere, and we learn whether or not it's spending most of its time on the windward side, whether or not it's moving further offshore. So this shows all the vessel track lines. All of these squiggly yellow lines are where the boat has gone over the years. We're in our 18th year now. Off this island, we've worked out here in 15 different years. The last 15 years in a row. Off Kauai, 9 different years with a few gaps. And less time in the middle, in between Oahu and Maui Nui. And one of the reasons why we've spent so much time working off this island is because the island itself creates such a large lee that we can get much further offshore here than we can anywhere else. And the deep water is so close to shore that we get to see a lot of very deep water species that it's almost impossible to see off other islands. Now this shows all of the sightings that we've had over that period of time. Basically everywhere we've looked for whales and dolphins, we've found whales and dolphins. And this is just toothed whales, this doesn't include humpback whales. So all the way offshore, in between the islands, the little bit of time that we spent over on the windward side of the island, we've found lots of animals over there as well. So this kind of small boat work basically allows us to study them near shore, around the islands themselves. But as I mentioned earlier, there's a whole northwestern Hawaiian Islands, there's a lot of offshore areas. And most of what's known about those species of whales and dolphins in offshore waters and Hawaiian waters comes from the large vessel surveys that the National Marine Fisheries Service has undertaken. So this vessel up here in the top corner is the SETI, and all of these yellow lines are basically survey track lines where they're actively looking for whales and dolphins. They did a survey of the entire Hawaiian exclusive economic zone in 2003, another one in 2010. They're going to be doing another one this year, starting in just over a month. And then they've done some more directed surveys among both the northwestern Hawaiian Islands and around the main Hawaiian Islands. Actually, this photo was from off of Kona last year. We were working with them jointly, and we found a group of killer whales and got a photo of the SETI with some killer whales in the background. Now, the third main source of information on what whales and dolphins in Hawaii are doing seasonally and throughout the islands actually comes from acoustics. And that's because most species of whales and dolphins have very distinctive species-specific calls. So blue whales make these very low frequency calls. That's an example of them up on the top. It's the frequency of the call and the time on the bottom. And those calls will travel over many, many miles. This bottom example is a beaked whale click, and each species of beaked whale has its own particular click. So this setup here over on the left side is an example of a hydrophone system that people have used to record these types of calls. It's called a high-frequency acoustic recording package. It was designed by researchers at Scripps. It sits down on the bottom with a big weight. It's got a couple release mechanisms so that you can actually send a signal down to it, and this part will all float up to the surface. And then a hydrophone up here, and basically a lot of batteries and hard drives. There's actually been one of these harps that has been off of the Kona coast almost continually since 2007. And it's basically been out there for usually 6 months at a time. And then someone, either the SETI or we've gone out and collected it and redeployed it for the Science Center, basically recovers it, downloads all the data, puts new batteries in, new hard drives in, and puts it back down again. And that acoustic information has really provided a tremendous amount of information, in particular for some of the baleen whales. Now, Rod mentioned most of what we study are toothed whales, but I want to mention baleen whales really quickly, primarily because most people seem to think that there's only one species of baleen whale in Hawaii, which is the humpback whale. And in fact, there are 6 other species. Now, one of these, the North Pacific right whales, actually only being reported a couple times, and unlikely to see them anytime soon, in part because the population is so small, just a couple hundred individuals in the North Pacific. But some of these other species, one of them is actually found in Hawaiian waters year-round, and the other ones are basically showing up in Hawaiian waters every winter and sometimes in the summer as well. Now, it wasn't until 2012, after we 13th year of working on the water, where we actually saw a baleen whale that wasn't a humpback whale ourselves. This was off of the south coast of Lanai, and spotted a large whale below in the distance, went over to it, and instead of a humpback whale, we saw this long expanse of the back, a very different dorsal fin, and this turned out to be a fin whale. It's the second largest species of whale. This one actually has a little hole through the dorsal fin, so it's a distinctive individual. Like humpback whales, you can use those kinds of markings to recognize it. And so with our one fin whale encounter and a few other fin whale photos that we were able to get from other people, we actually started up a small fin whale catalog. Now, blue whales, which are the largest species of whale in the world, are also found in Hawaiian waters. That's actually been known for a long time, mainly because of those acoustic systems that I mentioned. The Navy had one off of Kaneohe Bay that was picking up blue whale vocalizations back in the 60s. Now, what's most interesting, and this is actually a photograph of a blue whale from Hawaiian waters up near French Frigate Shoals. What's interesting from blue whales and the acoustics is they've actually picked up blue whale calls off the harp off of Kona. Not just in the winter when you would sort of expect blue whales to be here, but in the summer, I think, of 2010, there were blue whale vocalizations recorded here off of Kona. And blue whale calls are very, very loud, and they travel a long way. So it's possible that those blue whales were 50 or even 100 miles offshore, but it just sort of shows you that, that these other species are out there, and people have to be thinking about them. This is one of Doug Perrine's photos, a local photographer of a sei whale, photographed here off Kona back in 1995. It's a smaller cousin of the blue whale and fin whale. Very poorly known species of baleen whale that, again, based on the acoustics, comes to Hawaiian waters every winter. And there's one other closely related species that's smaller still, called a Brutus whale. And this is the one that I mentioned is actually resident in tropical waters year-round. So all the other baleen whales spend their summers in cold, high-latitude areas and their winters in warmer areas for breeding, but Brutus whales are non-migratory, so they're actually here year-round. This is a map of sightings of Brutus whales and another species that's probably Brutus whales, but they weren't able to say for sure. And you can see they're distributed throughout the entire archipelago, although there's never been a sighting right around the main Hawaiian Islands that's been confirmed. So for those of you who are on the water, it's a challenge there. Just need to get photos. I'll actually go back. One of the ways that Brutus whales and sei whales are discriminated is by these head ridges. Sei whales have a single head ridge, and Brutus whale have 3 head ridges. So if you see any baleen whales out there that you don't know what they are, or even if you do know what they are, try to get a head photo, because that's something that is going to be really important. And I've talked to a few different people who have seen, well, one of the things about both Brutus and sei whales is sometimes they're quite social. They'll travel around in groups of 10 or 20 individuals. And I've talked to 3 or 4 different people who have seen groups of small baleen whales off of Kona. Just none of them have ever gotten photos to be able to confirm which species it is. Now, this little inset map I'll point out is actually of whaling records of Brutus whales from Hawaiian waters. Both the Soviets and the Japanese were hunting whales in the Hawaiian exclusive economic zone as recently as about 1976, and that was before the U.S. had basically set a fisheries exclusion zone. But they killed about 300 British whales just north of the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. Now, in terms of the toothed whales, there's 3 different families of toothed whales found in Hawaiian waters: the beaked whales, the sperm whales, and the oceanic dolphins. And actually, killer whales and pilot whales and false killer whales are all members of the oceanic dolphin family. Now, I'll talk about beaked whales first. And beaked whales are unusual for a couple different reasons. Probably the thing they're most famous for is that they actually have the longest and deepest dives of any species of whale or dolphin in the world. We've documented Cuvier's beaked whale, which this one is, here in Hawaii, diving down to 2,800 meters deep. In the Atlantic, for some work that Daniel and I are doing there with folks from Duke University, one of the Cuvier's beaked whales tagged in the Atlantic, I think, went down to 3,500 or 3,500 meters deep. They can hold their breath for over 2 hours. So they're basically considered to be extreme divers. Now, a little bit about this particular, I mean, I was always impressed by Darren, Rebecca's diving ability, but yeah, that's true. A couple things about beaked whales. So this is an adult male beaked whale. If you look at the tip of the upper or tip of the lower jaw, there's a little tooth visible. Only the male have teeth that erupt from the gums. And right around that tooth, there's little patches of brown, and those are actually stalked barnacles that adhere to the hard surface of the tooth. Now, this animal has a lot of these oval white spots on it, and those white spots are actually caused by this creature. It's a cookie cutter shark. Beaked whales, I mentioned, they're spending a lot of time really deep in the water column. Cookie cutter sharks are a deep water shark. They only really come up to the surface at night. And beaked whales basically are bitten regularly by these cookie cutter sharks. And unlike a lot of other species, when they're bitten, they don't really repigment. So you can see those white oval scars for many years. We've actually have some individual Cuvier's beaked whales in our catalog where you can still see the same scars from 20 years later. Now, the scarring patterns are so distinctive that it ends up making them very, very easy for us to identify. Most species of whales and dolphins, you use the dorsal fin and the markings on the dorsal fin. But from this photo of a pair of Cuvier's beaked whales breaching from probably a quarter of a mile away, we could actually identify the individual on the right. We could match it to our catalog, and it was an individual that's being documented off of Kona since, I think, about 2004, 2006. Now, we've been able to use the photo identification information to estimate abundance, and also we've tagged individuals so we know an idea of their movement. The Cuvier's beaked whales around the island of Hawaii tend to be resident to this island. They'll move a little bit over towards Maui, and they use the windward side of the island, but they're definitely resident to the island. They're not moving really far offshore. And the population is only about 50 individuals. Now, this species is the other reason why Cuvier's beaked whales are fairly well known is it's the single species of whale or dolphin in the world that's probably most subject to impacts from Navy sonar. And that goes back to what I mentioned at the beginning of the fact that they're these extreme divers. And what happens when animals that are doing these types of repetitive breath hold dives is that their physiology changes when they go down. And Darren's does as well, really. I mean, your heart rate slows, your blood flow changes so that the animals are able to hold their breath for 2 hours. And what's thought to happen is that if they're exposed to Navy sonar when they're down on one of these 2-hour-long dives and they react by startling, then you think an animal that's basically shunted all the blood flow just to the essential organs and is moving very, very slowly and physiologically is toned itself down so it can stay down there for so long, and then all of a sudden it panics, then that's when you start to see the kinds of problems. And there's a number of cases where Cuvier's beaked whales in various parts of the world have ended up washing up dead on shore with basically gas bubble lesions that are similar to the bends. Now, another species of beaked whale that's out here off Kona, it's also resident to the island. Again, the teeth in this case are not at the tip of the jaw. They're back. This is an adult male, and this one happens to have a large number of barnacles attached around each of the teeth. Again, you can see the cookie cutter scars. This is Blainville's beaked whale. And we've done a similar type of abundance estimate of Blainville's beaked whales here in Hawaii, about 120 animals around this island. And I will note that most of the really beautiful underwater photos that I'm going to show tonight are all of Darren's. And in part, because Darren is such a good freediver, he's able to go down and take these kinds of photos without blowing bubbles, without disturbing the animals, because he's moving relatively effortlessly through the water column. Blainville's beaked whales are fairly social compared to Cuvier's. Cuvier's we often see alone or 2 or 3, whereas Blainville's sometimes are in groups of 5, 6, or 7 individuals. I mentioned the satellite tagging. This shows satellite tag deployments on about a dozen Blainville's beaked whales over about a 6-year period. Most of them are just in yellow, but one individual, I've got the points as well. It was tagged down off South Kona, went down off South Point, a little bit offshore, and then eventually went all the way up north of Maui, Molokai, and over towards Oahu. But I said it's about a dozen individuals. Almost all of them have stayed right along the west side of the island. They haven't really used the windward side much. A couple little short offshore trips before they've come back in. But it just sort of shows you how important the west side of the island is to these animals. There's a third species that we've actually only ever seen on a single occasion here in Hawaii, although there have been a half dozen other reports of them off of Kona, called a Longman's beaked whale. Now this species is one of the least known species of whales in the world. They were only sort of rediscovered about 20 years ago. They've been seen in a number of locations. There's one stranding from Maui, but they're seen so infrequently that no one really knows how deep they dive or where they go or anything about their social organization. But when we go offshore, yesterday we were about 30 kilometers offshore of Kona, at least this is what I'm hoping we're going to see. We've only seen them once, so perhaps it's a bit ambitious hope, but you never know when we'll see them again. Now, the other thing about beaked whales, when I showed you that example of the acoustic signals and mentioned that beaked whales have distinctive acoustic signatures, there's actually been another type of click of a beaked whale recorded on the Kona harp. It's also being recorded on a harp off Hawaii. It's been recorded out across seamount acoustically. It's being recorded up in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. But no one knows what species of beaked whale it is. It isn't a Cuvier's, it isn't a Blainville's, and it isn't a Longman's beaked whale, because all of those have been well documented as to what kind of sounds they make. And people think it might be this species, ginkgo-tooth beaked whale. And the reason why they think that is that same type of acoustic echolocation click has been documented at some other areas where ginkgo-tooth beaked whales are known to live, off southern Japan and off southern California. And up in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, there's another echolocation click that is distinct from all of the other beaked whales. And even though neither of these species have been documented in Hawaiian waters, based again on the distribution of that signal across the Pacific, it's thought that it's probably a Hubb's beaked whale. So the other thing, when we see beaked whales, you can tell them apart by the teeth. I mentioned that Cuvier's has the tooth at the tip of the lower jaw. Blainville's has the big teeth that go well up above. You can see these two have very, very different teeth as well. So again, it's a challenge for those of you who work out in the water. If you see beaked whales, trying to get head photos could be really important. These animals are probably here in Kona, but no one's ever been able to prove it. So again, it's one of those things we really hope we'll eventually be able to document. Now, sperm whales, this is an iconic whale from Moby Dick. We actually see sperm whales fairly regularly off of Kona. They're not common, but we see them often enough to know something about what they're doing. We've satellite tagged a number of individuals. They're not resident to the islands like the Blainville's or Cuvier's beaked whales. They definitely move sort of in all directions across the central North Pacific. We mainly see groups of females and juveniles. The females and juveniles stay in the tropics year-round. It's only the males that move up to really high latitude areas. But they tend to be seen primarily out in very deep water here in Hawaii. Now they have a very closely related cousin, much smaller cousin, called the Dwarf sperm whale. This individual is an individual that we've actually photographed off of this island over a 10-year period. It's an adult female. We know that because we've seen her with calves several times, and has a very distinctive dorsal fin. Again, a challenge for anyone who works out in the water. We haven't seen her in, I think, 2.5 years now. We're hoping that she's still around. We actually know more about dwarf sperm whales here in Hawaii than anywhere else in the world because of the calm waters off of Kona. We're actually able to get photos. We're able to document the same individuals over time, and we know from that they're resident to the Kona coast. Now, dwarf sperm whales share something in common with Cuvier's beaked whales and Blainville's beaked whales, and that's their susceptibility to impacts from sonar. This is a dwarf sperm whale that live stranded off of Kauai a few years ago, right during a submarine commander's course that was occurring off the northwest side of Kauai. And that's a training exercise that the Navy uses where they're using a couple surface vessels trying to track down a submarine and using this very intense mid-frequency sonar. And this whale basically, I think, fled from the area and ended up coming around Kilauea Point into Kilauea Stream. And it was doing that because that was the area that got it away from the sonar. So it's a species that's poorly known, but that is one of the things we know about it is they are impacted from sonar. Now, the other thing I'll point out about this animal is it has this white patch along the side of the head, which is referred to as a false gill. And it's thought that dwarf sperm whales, and they have another closely related relative called a pygmy sperm whale, basically are shark mimics. So it makes it look like they have a gill plate like a shark. And that's because they really don't have much in the way of defending themselves. They spend a lot of time up at the surface. And the idea is that if a shark swims by and thinks it's another shark, then it may just continue on its way. This one also, you can see this is a relatively fresh bite from a cookie cutter shark. So it doesn't protect them from those pesky little cookie cutter sharks, but it might from larger shark attacks.
Is that epidural hemorrhage that we're looking at?
Yes, yeah, this animal is still alive and had been on the beach for a while and was basically struggling and now there are several other species of pelagic, so now I'm into the oceanic dolphins, the last group. And there's several other species that are also thought to be open ocean populations like sperm whales and Longman's beaked whales. That includes striped dolphins. We've seen striped dolphins off of Kona, I think probably 30 times over the years. It also includes rhesus dolphins. Prior to yesterday, we had seen rhesus dolphins exactly 10 times in Hawaii. Yesterday, we had our 11th sighting. Rhesus dolphins are a fairly large dolphin, and the older animals are all covered with these tooth rakes and other types of scars. They're similar to Cuvier's beaked whales in that when they get scarred up by something, those scars basically remain for life. So the older ones just get whiter and whiter and whiter. Now we don't know a lot about most of these pelagic species because they live in the open ocean. We don't see them very often. But in 2015, we actually had a good encounter with rhesus dolphins, and I threw this in because of our encounter yesterday. This shows about a 2-week track of one of the one and only rhesus dolphin we've ever satellite tagged. Satellite tagged just offshore of Kona, and in that 2 weeks, it basically meandered out mainly in water that was 4,000 to 5,000 meters deep. And again, you compare that to the track of, say, the Blainville's beaked whales, which are clearly island associated, and this seems to be part of an open ocean population. Another open ocean species that we've only ever seen on 4 occasions are this species called a Fraser's dolphin. They don't like boats. They definitely, all 4 times we've seen them, they've been avoiding the boat, so we just get a few photos and move on. But they're very distinctive, not only because of this big black stripe down the sides, but if you look at the dorsal fin, the thing that's different about this species is the dorsal fin is very small relative to the body size. And so are the pectoral flippers. You compare them to all the other species of whales and dolphins, they're really very, very small dorsal fins. Another species that we've encountered that again appears to be part of a pelagic or open ocean population is the killer whale. This is a photo from an encounter we had in 2013. And a couple things I'll point out about this individual. One is it's got a number of remoras on the side. Also on the dorsal fin, it actually has one of the satellite tags that I mentioned. You can see the little black thing in the dorsal fin. If you look at this, you can actually see the ribs, but this animal isn't particularly emaciated in any way. If you look at the back here, it actually has these fairly robust muscles on the back. And I think the reason why you can see the ribs is because this is it's not a killer whale from the Pacific Northwest that spends most of its time in cold water that just happened to come to Hawaii. This is a tropical killer whale. It doesn't need the big blubber body stores for insulation. So instead, it's got these really robust muscles for locomotion, but it's not storing a lot of fat on the sides. Now, we've only ever seen killer whales in Hawaii 5 times. Wasn't sure if it's 4 or 5. First time we saw him here off Kona in 2003, and we saw a group of melon-headed whales scattering, and the killer whales came up right in the middle of them. We saw killer whales off of Kauai, I think in 2011, and they were chasing a rough-toothed dolphin. And we saw the group last year that weren't hunting. But this particular group, the next day, Darren and a couple other people went out and found them again, and they were feeding on a big-eyed thresher shark. So this is one of Darren's photos from that encounter the day after we tagged them. And killer whales here in Hawaii appeared, unlike the ones in the Pacific Northwest, where they either feed just on fish or just on the marine mammals. Killer whales here in Hawaii tend to be generalists. And a lot of that goes back to what I mentioned at the very beginning, which is that it's a very low productivity environment. And so there's not really the tremendous abundance of any particular type of prey for them to specialize on fish or specialize on marine mammals. They've been seen attacking a humpback whale calf off Kauai. One animal that's stranded on Lanai a number of years ago had squid in the stomach. So they're probably feeding on almost everything they encounter. People often ask, do they feed on monk seals? And they probably don't overlap with monk seals much because all the sightings in Hawaii tend to be out in fairly deep water. So they tend to avoid the relatively shallow water areas that monk seals are found. Another relatively closely related species is called a pygmy killer whale. It doesn't really look anything like a killer whale. It got the name because of the skull and the teeth. Killer whales, as you can imagine, have very big teeth, and pygmy killer whales actually have very big teeth relative to their skull size. So when they were first described, which was from 2 different skulls, the person who described them said, well, it's very, very similar to a killer whale, but the skull is much, much smaller. There's a resident population of pygmy killer whales here off of Kona, and it's actually the most well-known population of this species anywhere in the world. It's the only known resident population anywhere in the world, and these individuals are ones that Dan McSweeney was photographing off of Kona back in the mid-'80s. So they go all the way back to the mid-'80s. They, like the other species, they're regularly bitten by cookie cutter sharks, so you can see the scars on this animal. But otherwise, we don't know a lot about pygmy killer whales, other than the fact that they're resident here, because when we see them, well, we've never seen them feeding. They seem to do all of their feeding at night, and I've never talked to anyone who's ever seen them feeding. So we don't really know what they're feeding on or much about their patterns, because normally you just see them sort of resting motionless at the surface. Now, one thing I mentioned about pygmy killer whales for any of you who are boaters is they're definitely can be quite shy of boats. If boats approach them, they may just veer away, and we've actually been able to get some of our best photos and some of our best encounters by just putting the boat in neutral. They seem to be quite curious about boats that are in neutral, and in fact, once I learned that, if there's a group of them here, and you go up and just stop here and put the boat in neutral, we've actually had them turn and come straight over to us and swim past the stern or swim past the bow. So I think they don't experience boats that are in neutral very often. They regularly experience them when they're following them around or moving through the area, but boats that are in neutral are something that they're curious about. Now, there's another species that looks very similar to the pygmy killer whale that's also resident in the area called a melon-headed whale. And one of the differences between pygmy killer whales and melon-headed whales is that melon-headed whales are found in much, much larger groups. We've actually seen groups of up to 800 melon-headed whales. And there's a resident population of melon-headed whales off of Kohala. Total population of about 400 or 500 individuals. And again, like the pygmy killer whales and the Blainville's beaked whales and Cuvier's beaked whales, this population, we've satellite tagged some. They basically stay off Kohala. They don't go anywhere else that we're aware of. And here's another view of a melon-headed whale. Like I said, it looks very similar to a pygmy killer whale, except this darker cape below the dorsal fin goes much lower on the body, and it doesn't have the same kinds of scarring that pygmy killer whales have. I mentioned pygmy killer whales have big teeth, which typically means they have a lot of big white scars on them, whereas melon-headed whales have very, very small teeth, so they don't end up quite as scarred up. Now this is a map of a number of locations from satellite-tagged melon-headed whales off of Kohala. I mentioned this Kohala resident population. And this population actually seems to have the smallest range of any of the species of whales or dolphins here in Hawaii. They've been seen as far south as Town, and we had one satellite-tagged animal that went further up in the channel, but very, very restricted range. And melon-headed whales, like the beaked whales and like dwarf sperm whales, are also one of these species that is impacted by Navy sonar. You may have heard about the Hanalei Bay event back in 2004. It was, this is a photo from that. A group of about 150 or 200 melon-headed whales came into Hanalei Bay during one of the RIMPAC exercises. And they basically came into very, very shallow water. They were showing this really sort of in distress, pre-stranding behavior. But local residents got together and basically, well, one, people let the Navy know about it. The Navy stopped using sonar. And then local residents got together, and the next morning they herded the melon-headed whales back out into the open. So only a single one died from that event. Another resident species that most of you may have seen if you spend time on the water out here are bottlenose dolphins. From photo ID, again, there's a small resident population of about 150 bottlenose dolphins off this island. And it's one of the species that we're working with on this trip. We actually found a group a few days ago, and we put one of our satellite tags on to look at movements around the island. Now, further offshore, there's another closely related species called rough-toothed dolphins. This one you can see also has a number of remorers on it, and it's probably why it's jumping to try to get rid of the remorers. And again, from our photo ID, there's a resident population of rough-toothed dolphins off this island. So you're getting the message. There's a lot of species that are resident to this island, and I'm going to show you a little bit in a minute a comparison of what's resident off this island to some of the other islands. Another resident species are spotted dolphins, and spotted dolphins are actually the most abundant dolphin around the main Hawaiian Islands. They represent about 20% of all of our encounters, and the group sizes are typically 60 or 70 or 80 individuals, and when you add all of that up, they're very, very abundant. They are subject to a lot of attention from fishermen out here. Spotted dolphins are well known for being associated with ahi. So ahi actually follow the dolphins around, and fishermen take advantage of that. I don't know whether or not this is hit by a vessel propeller. I don't know if it was from a fishing vessel or tour vessel or what, but it's something that they're definitely exposed to, and at least occasionally they are hooked. This is a photo that Darren took of a spotted dolphin that's hooked in the upper jaw and leaping. And so one of the things we've been interested in is understanding, how many spotted dolphins are out here, how far do they range, and how well the population is doing. So it's a species that we've spent a fair amount of time working with. Now, just two more species. Short-fin pilot whales, which is actually the species of whale that we see more often than any other. They're not as abundant as spotted dolphins because the groups are a lot smaller, but they represent almost a quarter of all of our sightings. There's, again, a resident population. We have photos from Dan McSweeney that go back to the mid-'80s, and the same individuals that he was seeing there around Kona then we're seeing today. They're well known in the local community because of their association with oceanic whitetip sharks. And oceanic whitetips basically follow pilot whales around. People have often wondered why that is. Are they trying to feed on the whales? But basically, I think they're scavenging from them. And there are certainly occasions where people have seen them. A whale defecates, and the shark will swim through and eat what it's left behind. Sometimes they will also bring squid up from deep water and drop a piece, and I think the sharks also take advantage of that. And I wouldn't be surprised if the sharks also sort of benefit from the whale's ability to find schools of squid and follow them down when they go down on their deep foraging dives. Now, pilot whales in Hawaii are definitely homebodies. This shows two different individuals that we've satellite tagged, one that we tagged off of South Hawaiian. This was over about a 200-day period, and the animal came all the way down to Lanai and west of Ko'olave, up around Oahu, but you can see it basically is just staying in that Oahu, Maui Nui area. This one down here, tagged off South Kona, I think this one was a 99-day track, and that 99-day period, this animal really just stayed around the southern half of the island. And we've now tagged pilot whales off all the islands and have a really good idea that there's both a pelagic open ocean population and these separate resident communities off different islands. Now, I mentioned that most of what I've talked about so far has been about Kona. And we've had the opportunity to work off all the islands, and we've found some quite striking differences. So off of Kauai Niihau, there's only 4 resident species: pilot whales, spinner dolphins, rough-toothed dolphins, and bottlenose dolphins. When you move to the east off of Oahu and Maui Nui, there's 6 resident species, those same 4 that are here, as well as spotted dolphins and pygmy killer whales. But when you move to the island of Hawaii, there's actually 10 different resident species off of this island. So Kona is special. You can all be happy about being here in Kona. And then the 11th resident species, which I mentioned, are false killer whales. And false killer whales are moving. It's a resident population, but that's resident to the main Hawaiian Islands themselves. Now, even though there's 11 different resident species off of Kona, they're all using the habitat differently. Some are diving incredibly deep, like sperm whales and beaked whales. Some are feeding up near the surface, like rough-toothed dolphins and spotted dolphins. But also where you see them varies. So there's some very shallow water species like spinners, bottlenose, and melon-headed whales. There are some species that are out in slightly deeper water on the slope. Dwarf sperm whales and Blainville's beaked whales and pygmy killer whales. You go further offshore and you see, again, deeper water species, pilot whales and spotted dolphins, and then out in really deep water, species like Cuvier's beaked whales and rough-toothed dolphins. So even though they're all here, they're all resident here, they're basically partitioning the environment, both in terms of where in the water column they're foraging and to some degree where they are relative to shore. And false killer whales are basically overlapping with all of the ranges from very near shore out to very deep water because they're feeding on something different from the other species. So I'm going to end with false killer whales. And mainly because they're my favorite species, and I think if you're going to remember anything at the end of this, I want you to remember false killer whales. I also have stickers, for those of you who like stickers, which I put out on the table over there. And they go well on water bottles, laptop, computers. Whales are my favorite species for a couple different reasons. Hawaii is probably the best place in the world to see false killer whales. They're a tropical open ocean species, and here in Hawaii, they, like many of these other ones I've mentioned, have made the islands themselves a home. They share a lot of traits with killer whales in the sense that they're long-lived. The females live into their 60s. They have very strong social bonds. When you see a group together, it's probably a mother and her offspring. They only give birth about once every 6 or 7 years. They have very long calving interval. And like killer whales and pilot whales, and actually with humans, the females go through menopause. So basically, they'll reproduce into their 40s, and then they'll live 20 or more years longer than that. And it's thought that, like pilot whales and killer whales and humans, the reason why they go through menopause is because it's more valuable to be a grandmother or an auntie than it is to continue to have more kids, because those older individuals carry the cultural knowledge. They know they lead the group when there's an El Nino or some sort of large-scale oceanographic event that makes it hard to find food. They know the best places to forage, and they know how that may change over time as water temperature or other factors change. Now, false killer whales are also like killer whales in that they're top predators. Top predators are naturally rare, so false killer whales are rare. Here in Hawaii, they feed primarily on game fish. Ono, mahi-mahi, ahi, swordfish, aku, opa, mongchong. And when they catch fish, they also, like killer whales, will share their prey. So we've seen on a number of occasions where you'll have a group spread out over an area. One of them will start chasing a fish, and then all of the other ones in the area will converge. And one of the interesting things about their prey sharing that we've never seen with other species, and I've never really heard of with any other species, is that they will share the prey without actually consuming it. And so what I mean by that is one of them will catch a fish, he'll take this intact fish and it'll give it to a second individual who then may give it to a third individual who then may give it back to the first individual. And I think of it as what me and my buddies do when we go out and we buy each other drinks, we buy each other dinner, and we do that because we're buddies, we're friends, we've known each other for a long time, we know that we're doing it for social bonding. And I think false killer whales are doing it for that reason as well, because these are long-term hunting companions. These are individuals that they're spending their entire lives with, and because they're cooperative hunters, having that trust, having that relationship is really important for them in order to be able to successfully go out and forage and make a living. False killer whales, I mentioned they're top predators. Top predators are naturally rare. False killer whales have the smallest population size of any of the species that I've mentioned. There's a resident main Hawaiian Island population that's between about 150 and 200 individuals. And that population was listed as endangered in 2012 for a couple reasons that I'll talk about in a minute. Now, the other thing that we've seen them doing, which is another trait that they share with humans, I think. Can anyone tell me what fish this is? Yeah, it's a crown toby. It's a type of puffer. Now, if you look at crown tobies online, eating them is not recommended because they're highly poisonous. But you may have seen in the news in the last few months about these bottlenose dolphins that were mouthing puffer fish because, sorry, what was it? To get high, I think is what the person because small amounts of it, the bottlenose dolphins. And bottlenose dolphins, they've actually been able to document changes in the behavior of it over time. And we didn't see that with this crown toby, but they were mouthing it and passing it back and forth, and then they just and did not try to eat it. So we've been using the satellite tag information to get an idea of the movements of these animals. And one of the things you can see from this that's quite different from the other maps I've shown is that they're moving among all the main Hawaiian Islands. This is a 99-day track using both the windward and leeward side of the island, all the way from Niihau, and even though it shows a line going through the middle of the island, this animal went around all the way past the kilo side.
Not a big lava tube.
With the gaps in between the satellite locations. There could be lava tubes. But the other thing you can see is they're out both in very deep water and in relatively shallow water. As I mentioned, they're crossing the ranges of a lot of the other species. Here's another individual, 105 days. This one obviously likes the Maui Nui area, unlike the previous one. We tagged it down here off South Kona, but then it moved over to Lanai and Molokai and basically spent almost all of its time over in that area. And what we've learned from maps like this, combined with the photo identification, is that, and I mentioned these are animals with these long-term stable groups, is that different pods or clusters of false killer whales show preference for different islands. So while they may move throughout all the main Hawaiian Islands, this particular cluster that we now call Cluster 4 seems to show a real strong preference for the Maui Nui area. Now I mentioned false killer whales were listed as endangered in 2012, and there's a couple different reasons for that. One is that the population declined. Back in the 1980s, the population was thought to be somewhere between about 400 and 700 individuals, and it's down to less than 200 today. And the big question is, what are the reasons for that? And there's probably a couple different reasons. One is that they're top predators, and they're feeding on a lot of fish that are basically bioaccumulating contaminants like PCBs and flame retardants and that kind of thing. And we've been collecting little skin biopsies from these animals and skin and blubber biopsies that we've sent to toxicologists. And basically, every single adult male in the population has levels of PCBs, which is industrial chemical, that are high enough to cause immune suppression. And a good proportion of the females do as well. The reason why less females have such high levels is because these types of contaminants are lipophilic. They're transferred in the milk. And so when a mother has a calf and nurses that calf, basically it transfers most of its toxin load to its calf. So the mother's levels go down, but then the calf levels go up. Now the other reason why the population declined is because of what they eat. Again, they're feeding on fish that you and I like to eat. I mean, I had ono for dinner, actually. And they like to eat ono. But I mentioned the prey sharing, where they'll share prey among themselves. I think when they see a fish on the end of a line, they think that, hey, that fish is readily available. And so they have a reputation for taking fish from fishermen. And at least on some occasions, they do get caught, hooked. This particular individual was hooked in the mouth and actually has two broken teeth there and missing a lot, because it got tangled up on the line and struggled against it, and it just sort of ripped through. One of the things we're trying to do with our photo identification program is document both head photos for this kind of thing and also photos of injuries that we see on the dorsal fin. Now, we actually have, I think about 8% of the individuals in the population have injuries that are line injuries on the leading edge of the dorsal fin. This is a fresh one. This one probably happened a couple months earlier. And we haven't seen this individual since. This was from last October off of Oahu, but we think it'll heal. We don't think that this will kill it, more that it's an indicator of something that the animal's experiencing in its environment. So again, if any of you guys are out in the water and taking photos, the photos are really important for documenting these kinds of things. And false killer whales, a lot of the work, well, I should mention the work we're here doing right now is trying to find false killer whales. Today was day 5, I think, of a 2-week project, going out every morning, covering as far as we can, both offshore and north and south, and basically staying in touch with folks who are out in the water, hoping to find false killer whales. In this particular case, we're really hoping we might find pelagic false killer whales. The ones I've talked about are resident insular ones, but there are also pelagic ones that come through on occasion. And a few years ago, when we had an encounter with pelagic false killer whales, we were able to satellite tag them, look at movements, and we're able to get data from the longline fishery to look at how those whales may be actually interacting with longline gear. And it's the insular animals population has been listed as endangered, but the pelagic animals are regularly interacting with longline gear and getting caught in longlines. So we're trying to use that information to work with the fishing community through a take reduction team that was set up by National Marine Fisheries Service a number of years ago to try to come up with solutions for reducing bycatch. And in the case of the pelagic longline fishery, they've made some changes to try to reduce bycatch. They've switched so they're only using circle hooks, and I don't know how many of you are fishermen, but circle hooks tend to hook the fish in the corner of the mouth, and false killer whales, when they take a fish, often leave the head attached to the line. So if you switch to circle hooks, you may still lose your catch, but you're less likely to hook the false killer whale. And the other thing they've done in the longline fishery is, as well as the weaker circle hooks, is they had to strengthen the terminal gear, the leader going up to the hook. So that basically makes the hook the weakest link in the chain, and that way they're more likely, if a false killer whale does get hooked, it's more likely to straighten the hook and get off. So there are solutions like that are currently being tried, and I think that can play a role both with the insular population and the pelagic population. So I think that's it for my slides, but I'd be happy to answer questions.
I noticed that the dwarf sperm whale and some of the beaked whales seem to have a very small mouth. Now, is that an illusion, or are they just really efficient eaters?
Yeah, so the question was how small the mouth of beaked whales and dwarf sperm whales have, and what I didn't mention is that some of those species, what they're feeding on is almost entirely squid, and they're thought to be suction feeders. And so actually having a small mouth, I think, is somewhat advantageous in the sense that they use echolocation to get really close to the squid, and then just suddenly open the mouth. Beaked whales actually have 2 throat grooves, so they can expand the throat and create a suction. But I think that would probably be a good explanation for the small mouth.
Of these various populations that are resident populations, that, like you said, the last one they went down to 200. Are they genetically isolated from other populations? So there's a worry about drift. And
yeah. So the question is about whether or not the small populations are genetically isolated. And we're actually collecting these biopsy samples that we collect for pollutants are also used for genetics, and we've collaborated with geneticists both at Scripps Institution of Oceanography, Oregon State University, Portland State University, and National Fisheries Service, who are doing genetic studies of a bunch of different species. The false killer whales, for those of you who are familiar with genetics, there's mitochondrial DNA, which is passed on from the mother, and then nuclear DNA, which is both sexes are passed on, both mother and father. And all the false killer whales in the resident population are very, what that tells us is that they all arose here, and they're very different from other populations. So that means they arose from one single colonization of the islands. Now, other species like pilot whales or bottlenose dolphins, which have also been studied, are also isolated, but they have a much greater diversity of mitochondrial haplotypes, which suggests that it wasn't a single group of bottlenose dolphins that colonized the islands. It's probably over time many separate groups that colonized, perhaps different islands, but there's more genetic exchange among the islands and offshore. So of all the species that the genetics have been looked at, which I think is about 6 now, false killer whales are the most isolated and the most genetically distinct.
Are you seeing any impact from the pollution that's given off by human existence from the islands? Are you seeing any difference where they're accumulating, where there may be pollution?
Well, it's funny because we've been collecting, so the question was about pollutants and where those pollutants are coming from to some degree. We had been collecting biopsy samples right from the beginning for genetic studies, and a number of people would ask me whether or not we were also looking at pollutants. And at the time, somewhat naively, I said, well, the water here is, it's so pristine. We're in the middle of the Pacific. It's got to be, the levels have to be pretty low. And then with false killer whales was the first species we looked at because we sort of realized there were other things going on with the population. And so when we looked at the pollutants, every individual has high levels, every male and most females. There is some insular signal. So for example, with false killer whales, one of the levels that's relatively high is Myrex, which was a pesticide used in the pineapple cultivation. So Myrex levels in false killer whales here are much higher than Myrex levels in other species of whales and dolphins elsewhere. But a lot of the pollutants that they are accumulating are ones that are transmitted through the atmosphere. They're transmitted through dust particles, through ocean currents, and so while there is some Hawaiian signature pollutants, they're picking up pollutants that are coming from Asia, from North America. I mean, what's interesting with pollutants is that in places like Puget Sound in Washington State, which was a cesspool for pollutants. I mean, there's a lot of industrial activity, dumping of pollutants there for many, many years. PCB levels in Puget Sound have been going down, whereas PCB levels in many other areas of the world are going up. And the reason why is because they don't live in Puget Sound. They are dispersed through currents and through the atmosphere and through fish. And so there's no longer an input into Puget Sound, but Puget Sound is now a net outflow of pollutants, and they show up in the Arctic. I mean, I really was naive thinking that they would have low levels here because, there's levels of pollutants, of pesticides in the Arctic where there was never any sources in the Arctic. And why I thought there would be low levels here, I don't know.
You're optimistic. Piggybacking off of that, you're talking about how they pass contaminants on through milk. Have you seen, or do you have enough data to see that impact on the calves or the population moving forward?
Yeah, it's a good question, and so it goes back to my plea for anyone who works on the water, anyone who might know anyone who works on the water, because in order to be able to look at whether or not calves are dying, we need to get photos of the calves when they're relatively young, and we need to get photos of the moms 6 months later, and a year later, and a year and a half later. And we work out in the islands a couple months a year. You work off all the different islands, but what I didn't really mention is that we get a lot of contributions, and when I show those three sources of information, acoustics and large vessel surveys and small vessel surveys, what I need to include in there is a tour vessel, because we actually get a tremendous number of photos from people who work on the water, everything from whale and dolphin watching operators, dive boats. Some fishermen are sending us photos. People who are just out recreational boating. So we're not really able to look at the impacts of calves, and it mainly comes down to insufficient photos to really document what's happening on a shorter time scale.
It's an observation, not a question, regarding the feeding of the false killer waves. It was really amazing because one time I was in the water and there was one who caught a fish, and it was on the bottom and it was holding the fish, and everybody, all the other false killer would come and very gently, and it's like more gentle than us human eat when we're out eating, taking a bite and then keep going, and that one will come take a bite while the one has it in its mouth.
Yep.
It was really impressive to see that civility.
Yes.
When they do eat those specific pufferfish, does the poison eventually wear off, or do they stay in those conditions of weird behavior?
Well, I think in the case of the bottlenose dolphins that have been seen mouthing pufferfish, I think it wears off after a while. Yeah, and I don't think that anyone's ever seen them eating them. I think they're just mouthing them, probably because they realize that if they ate them, that would be bad for them. I mean, they could kill them if they ate them. So I think they're just taking small doses.
What do you think would be the best thing to stop the Navy from using this sonar? How do we stop that?
Yeah. So the question was, how do we stop the Navy from using sonar? And I actually tend to be very pragmatic about it. I don't think we're ever going to stop the Navy from using sonar, but I think that we could potentially influence the Navy to use sonar in times and places that are less likely to cause impacts. So my biggest concern, remember the map I showed of the Melon-Headed Whales off of Kohala? My biggest concern for any single population of whales or dolphins here in Hawaii is that population of Melon-Headed Whales, because it's got the smallest range in one area of a species that is known to be susceptible to sonar. And there are no resident melon-headed whales off of Kauai, and it's possible there are no resident melon-headed whales off Kauai because the Navy's been regularly using sonar off Kauai for the last 40 years. Now, we work with the Navy a lot, and I've talked to people both in National Fisheries Service about this and the Navy about this. The Navy does most of its activities off of Kauai and only occasionally works elsewhere in the islands. I think that the best thing that we could do to protect certainly the resident populations off this island, the resident melon-headed whales, is get the Navy to say they're only going to use sonar off of Kauai. I think they've actually, if they've already had a lot of impacts off of Kauai and continuing to work there, I'm sorry if any of you are from Kauai, but continuing to just work there, I think would limit the impacts. And we put a report available on our webpage just a few days ago. We've been satellite tagging some of these resident species off of Kauai in association with Navy exercises. And what amazes me is that pilot whales, for example, are being exposed to Navy sonar and they're not leaving the area. And I think the reason why is because those are resident pilot whales that have been exposed to Navy sonar for their entire lives. And that's because the Navy uses sonar there multiple times a year, every year. Off of Kona, they rarely use sonar. And while that may be good because they're less often exposed, I think what it means is there's a large number of naive individuals in the populations here. And so, if they didn't use sonar off Kohala for 3 years and then used it again, I think they have the potential to cause, a group of 200 melon-headed whales to startle and go in and strand somewhere. So I've actually been encouraging the Navy to try to set aside an exclusion zone around the Big Island, and they are largely ignoring me at this stage. So, I think it's the best way to deal with the problem.
What do we know about like the habitat, the mechanisms behind the habitat delineation of the species? Like what's keeping the melon-headed whales? Do we know what's keeping the melon-headed whales right off Kohala, or why are the beaked whales following the west side up and then the northeast side of Maui Nui and all that? Can you comment on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, it's interesting because you can look at that on a couple different ways, and if you think about it from the perspective of, I'm going to go back to false killer whales for a second. Think about these social groups of false killer whales. To some degree, show the same kind of partitioning within the population by social group. And in the case of false killer whales, those are, I think, the reason why that is because the importance of the information that they learn on where the best foraging areas are, and what it really comes down to, it's better to hang out primarily here and occasionally move around than it is to spend all your time equally spread around the islands. And then there's these other social groups that are doing the same thing, but largely off a different island. And when you think of that in terms of what's going on with melon-headed whales, I think it's the same thing. Those resident melon-headed whales have learned that there are certain resources that they can predictably exploit that you know, are not being exploited by too many other species or other populations, and that it's just better for them to live in that area than it is to roam widely. I mean, what I didn't mention about melon-headed whales is there is also a pelagic population of melon-headed whales here in Hawaii. And what's interesting is those pelagic animals come sometimes within 5 or 10 miles of the Kohala residents. We've never documented them together. There's genetic differentiation. There's a paper that's coming out in the next couple weeks that actually talks about the genetic differentiation. They seem to be largely reproductively isolated, but it's a case where one population, the small Kohala resident population, has taken advantage of that particular niche, but then the much larger pelagic population is roaming offshore and offshore of all the islands, and it's sort of two different ways of getting at the same problem of how to make a living. And I think it's sort of goes back to the insular populations and the pelagic populations for all of the species. There are pelagic Cuvier's beaked whales and pelagic Blainville's beaked whales and pelagic bottlenose dolphins, and then the resident populations as well. And if all the pelagic ones decided to become resident, it would be a really bad option because they would all outcompete each other. And so, you know, it's sort of two different alternative foraging strategies, or in this case, two different alternative spatial use, habitat use strategies.
Do you have an opinion about the wisdom of swimming with dolphins and distinguishing swimming from shore versus swimming from boats?
Well, yes. You know, I think that when small numbers of people do things in a responsible and respectful way, it probably has little or no impact on the animals. And when large numbers of people do things, a lot of them in a responsible and respectful way, but some of them less so, I think it has impacts on the animals. So I think that if it was up to me, I'm a big supporter of wildlife viewing, wildlife experiences, because I think that that's important to get people interested and educated and inspired to protect the environment. But if it was up to me, what I would do, and it's not up to me, unfortunately, I would put a limited entry licensing system in so that, and you could do it today, and you would give everyone who currently is doing commercial operations a license, but you would make it so you could never sell or trade those licenses, and if you didn't use them within 3 months, the license would be taken away. And what would happen over time is the number of people that have licenses would go down and down and down, and you would then reduce it to a level that's sustainable. Personally, I don't think it's sustainable right now. I think that there's too many people doing it too often with too many species. Some of the species they're doing it with, I think, are very tolerant of human interactions, and others, I think, are much less tolerant. So swimming with pygmy killer whales, I think, harasses them the vast majority of times. I say the vast majority of times because I think when there's only occasional